She thought it was just a random act of kindness, leaving out food for a wild bobcat after a brutal winter storm. But the next morning, something unthinkable happened. The same bobcat returned, and it wasn't alone. Standing at her front door, eyes pleading, the animal carried a motionless bundle in its jaws. What do you do when a predator knocks, not to attack, but to beg for help? This is the incredible moment where instinct met trust, and a silent plea changed a woman's life forever. You won't believe what happened next. Before we dive into the story, please leave a comment below to let me know where in the world you're watching from today. Your engagement means the world to us. If you find this story truly captivating, please support us with a like and a follow. Every like and follow from you is a great motivation for us to continue creating more stories. And if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to leave it in the comments below. We are always ready to listen and improve to make our future stories even better. Thank you sincerely. Elena Rhodes had grown used to silence. The kind of silence you don't just hear, but feel. Thick with wind whispers through pine needles and the soft crunch of snow beneath deer hooves. That morning, as she stepped onto the porch of her cabin, nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains, the world was soaked in soft gray mist. Frost curled on the railing like lace. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of melting snow dripping from the eaves. She carried a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and her camera in the other. The porch was her daily sanctuary, a place where she could breathe with the forest and study it as it woke. Elena had been living in the cabin for nearly 4 years now, ever since she'd walked away from her life as a children's book illustrator in Portland. After a painful divorce and years of drawing other people's stories, she'd come to these woods to find her own. The clearing around the cabin opened up just enough to allow light in, but beyond the tree line, the forest was dense and old. Here, wildlife wasn't a novelty, it was a constant presence. She had photographed owls perched like ghosts at dusk, elk trampling through the snow in early morning hours, and even caught the glint of a black bear's eyes one golden October evening. But nothing prepared her for the bobcat. The first time she saw it, she nearly spilled her coffee. It had appeared silently, a tawny blur at the edge of the clearing, half hidden among the ferns and dead leaves. Its short, tufted ears flicked with attention. Muscles coiled under a spotted coat that shimmered in the dawn light. For a long moment it stood motionless, eyes fixed on her. Elena froze, camera halfway to her face. Then, slowly, as if in a dream, she lifted the lens, focused, and clicked. The shutter was quiet, but even that tiny sound made the bobcat's ears twitch. It turned its head slightly, then padded soundlessly back into the underbrush, vanishing as quickly as it had come. That night, Elena reviewed the images in breathless disbelief. The photos weren't perfect, low light, slightly out of focus, but the wildness in the bobcat's eyes was unmistakable. It was a female, she thought, based on size and posture. Young, but not a cub. Likely solitary, likely hungry. In the following week, the bobcat appeared 3 more times, always at dawn, always at the clearing's edge. It never came close, but it never fully disappeared either. Elena began waking earlier, positioning herself on the porch before sunrise with her coffee, her sketch pad, her camera. She gave the cat a name in her mind, not aloud, and not a pet name, just a placeholder. The Watcher. It was during the second week of these visits that Elena noticed something unsettling. The bobcat seemed thinner than before, ribs slightly more visible beneath the tawny fur, her movements slower. Winter had set in early, and prey was likely scarce. That's when the question began to nag. Should I help? As someone who deeply respected wildlife, She knew the rules. Do not interfere. Let wild animals stay wild. But what if that line wasn't so clear anymore? What if observation alone wasn't enough? She started small. One evening, after the light had faded, she placed a small dish of raw chicken about 20 feet from the porch, right at the clearing's edge. The next morning it was gone. Probably raccoons, she thought. She tried again. This time she sprinkled a light dusting of flour near the dish to capture footprints. The next morning, feline tracks, distinct, rounded pads, bobcat. Elena felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. She told herself it was a one-time thing, a temporary supplement during a hard winter. She emailed Dr. Callum Harris, a wildlife vet she'd met once during a conservation lecture years ago. He replied promptly, "Limited supplemental feeding isn't ideal, but it won't cause dependency if you keep it irregular, minimal, and maintain your distance at all times." She followed his advice exactly. She never approached the cat. She never left food in the same spot twice. She never tried to name her. But a relationship formed, however unspoken. The bobcat began to linger longer at the edge of the trees. Once, she lay in the weak winter sunlight for several minutes after finishing the meat, watching Elena with those steady amber eyes before turning away. "You're beautiful," Elena whispered one morning, standing just inside the porch door. "And you're not alone, are you?" Because now there were new tracks, smaller, lighter, following the bobcat's path. She hadn't seen the kitten yet, but the signs were there. Sometimes two shadows moved through the snow instead of one. Sometimes she heard a faint rustle deeper in the brush, out of sight. A mother. Elena's respect deepened. The bobcat wasn't just surviving the winter, she was doing so while caring for a young one. And still, somehow, she trusted Elena enough to come this close, to eat what she offered, to remain. But trust in nature is fragile. Elena knew that well. One wrong move, one misstep, and the bond, if you could even call it that, would vanish. So she stayed cautious. She stayed distant. She kept her voice low and her movements slow. Still, she wondered, was this enough? The storm arrived like a freight train. No build-up, no whisper of warning, just a sudden, furious roar of wind and white. By dusk on the first day, Elena's cabin was sealed in a sheath of ice. Snow piled high against the door, and gusts slammed into the pine trees like waves against a cliff. Even inside, wrapped in layers and cradling a mug of tea, she could feel the storm pressing against the walls of her home. She didn't leave the house for 3 full days. During that time, Elena's thoughts returned again and again to the bobcat, and to the kitten she had yet to see but knew, somehow, was out there. Each morning she gazed through frosted windows toward the woods, hoping to glimpse a shadow, a flicker of movement, anything to tell her they had survived. On the 4th day, the wind died. The sun broke through gray skies, revealing a world hushed and glowing. The trees stood heavy with snow, limbs bowing toward the earth. Elena pulled on snowshoes and her thickest coat. It took her nearly an hour to reach the clearing's edge, where she usually left food. She placed a small portion of venison inside a wooden shelter she'd built earlier in the season, a simple 3-sided box beneath a tree designed to protect from snow. Then she returned to the porch and waited. The next morning, tracks appeared. She could see them from the window, the unmistakable pattern of a bobcat's gait. But something was off. The prints wove back and forth, as if uncertain, unsteady. And there was no sign of the kitten's smaller tracks. Her stomach sank. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, but the stillness in the forest pressed down like weight. That afternoon, as she sat sketching by the fire, a noise stopped her hand mid-stroke. A scratching sound. Faint. Deliberate. Not wind. Not snow shifting on the roof. Coming from the front door. Elena stood slowly, heart thudding in her chest. She crossed the living room, placed one hand gently on the curtain, and pulled it back, and gasped. There, on the porch, stood the Bobcat. She had never come this close before, never crossed the invisible boundary between forest and human dwelling. But what froze Elena in place wasn't the mother. It was what lay at her feet. A kitten, half buried in snow, unmoving, except for the faint rise and fall of its chest, its back leg twisted at an unnatural angle, fur clumped with blood and ice. The mother didn't flee. She looked up at Elena through the glass, eyes fierce and wild, but no longer wary. There was something else in them now, something pleading. Elena opened the door slowly. The Bobcat didn't move. The cold air struck like a slap. Elena dropped to one knee, staying low. The kitten didn't respond. Its breathing was shallow, ragged. Carefully, Elena edged closer, murmuring softly. "It's okay. I'm here." The mother growled, low and strained, but didn't lunge. She took a step back, then another, circling to the far edge of the porch, still watching, ears pinned flat. Elena reached for the towel she'd tucked behind the door and gently wrapped the kitten. It was alarmingly light. Bones beneath fur. No resistance, no fight left. Tears blurred her vision as she placed the bundle inside a pet carrier, snapped it shut, and turned back toward the open door. The mother stood frozen, halfway between retreat and return. A sound left her throat, somewhere between a yowl and a sob. Then she turned and disappeared down the snow-covered steps. Inside, Elena laid the carrier by the fire and dialed the number she knew by heart. Dr. Callum Harris answered on the second ring. She explained everything in a rush: the porch, the kitten, the mother's behavior. When she finished, the line was silent for a moment. Then, "That's extraordinary," he said. "Elena, this is unprecedented. If a wild bobcat brought her injured kitten to your home, it's because she's out of options." "What do I do?" Elena asked, voice cracking. "I can't get to the highway. The back roads are buried." "I'll call the Wildlife Rehab Center and let them know you're coming," Dr. Harris said. "Do you have snow chains, emergency gear?" "Yes, I've got supplies." "Then go now. Every minute matters." She drove like her hands were part of the wheel, focused, silent, praying. The kitten, nestled in blankets on the passenger seat, didn't move. Elena spoke to him constantly. "You're strong. Your mama believes in you. Stay with me." After 3.5 hours of tense travel, she reached the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. A team was waiting. The carrier was whisked away, and Elena collapsed into the lobby chair, numb. Later, Dr. Harris called her into the exam room. "He's male, around 5 months old," he said gently. "Compound fracture in the leg. He's hypothermic and severely underweight. But he has a chance." Elena nodded, arms wrapped tight around her body. "I've been calling him Finch," she said quietly. "Just in my head." Dr. Harris smiled faintly. "Finch, that works." They stood together in silence, watching through the window as the kitten, Finch, was carefully tended by the vet team. There were no guarantees, no promises, except the one Elena had made. To a mother who had broken every instinct to ask for help, Elena had made many promises in her life, most small, some broken, but this one felt carved into her bones. She drove back from the Wildlife Center in silence, the absence of the tiny heartbeat beside her more deafening than any storm. Finch was in capable hands now, and yet every cell in her body urged her to turn around and wait with him. But she had no place there. Not yet. The next morning, she stood on the porch with her coffee, her breath visible in the crisp mountain air. The forest was still. Too still. No paw prints marred the new dusting of snow around the shelter. No rustle in the bushes. No shadow at the tree line. The mother bobcat didn't return. Not that morning. Not the next. Elena told herself it made sense. The mother had done something extraordinary, something that defied instinct, biology, every rule about how wild creatures behave. She had come to a human for help, surrendered her injured cub, and vanished. And yet, part of Elena still believed she might return. She began leaving food again, as before. Never too much, never too close. She even set up a trail camera in a tree, angled toward the shelter. For 5 nights, it captured nothing but wind. On the 6th, the bobcat came back. Not to eat, not to linger. Just to stand, silent and unmoving, at the clearing's edge. She stared toward the porch for several minutes before disappearing into the woods once more. When Elena reviewed the footage, tears stung her eyes. The bobcat hadn't approached the food. She hadn't sniffed or hunted. She had simply looked. "She's checking," Elena whispered to no one. "She's waiting." That afternoon, Elena drove back to the wildlife center. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and pine cleaner reminded her of hospitals and something else she couldn't quite name. The fragile place between hope and helplessness. Dr. Harris met her in the hallway. "He's stable, eating well, the leg's been set, and he's responding to treatment better than we expected." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He knows you," Dr. Harris added, softer. "When the techs bring you up in conversation, he perks up. Not like a domestic animal, just alert, connected." "Will he be released?" Elena asked. Dr. Harris didn't answer right away. He led her to a quiet room with a viewing window. Behind the glass, Finch rested in a small enclosure. Still mostly immobile, but no longer ghostly pale. His fur had been cleaned, his breathing calm. "There's a chance," Dr. Harris said. "But it's small. He's young, and this much human contact at a developmental stage can shift instincts permanently. He hasn't imprinted, but he also hasn't had time to learn how to be wild." Elena nodded, the answer sinking like snow on warm bark. "What are the options?" she asked. Dr. Harris pulled out a tablet and showed her a digital form. Long-term wildlife care application. "There's a program," he said, "for animals that can't be released but are still healthy enough to live full lives. It requires training, certification, inspection, and space. Most applicants are sanctuaries, but individuals can qualify." Elena stared at the form. "You're suggesting I keep him?" "I'm suggesting you prepare. If we can't release him, and it's looking that way, he'll need somewhere to go, and frankly, he already knows you. That matters." "I don't even have a proper enclosure," she said, "and I'm not a licensed rehabber." "Yet," Dr. Harris said with a small smile. "But you're smart, dedicated. You've already done more than most would. The process is tough, but doable. Think about it." She did. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena buried herself in coursework. She read every document, attended every virtual seminar, and filled every page of the training binder with notes. She contacted a builder in Pine Ridge who specialized in wildlife structures. Together, they sketched a plan for a large wooded enclosure on Elena's land, complete with rock outcrops, climbing logs, shaded dens, and even a shallow stream fed by runoff from the mountain above. Every decision she made was filtered through one question: would this feel natural for him? Meanwhile, she continued her visits to the wildlife center. Finch's strength grew each day. He began exploring the indoor enclosure, testing his healing leg, playing, tentatively at first, then with bursts of wild energy that made Elena laugh through tears. She kept her distance. She didn't pet him, didn't feed him by hand, but she spoke to him, gently, from across the room, and watched as he tilted his head, ears twitching, eyes alert. The staff admired her restraint. "You might be the one person he associates with safety," one tech said. Elena didn't reply. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Back at the cabin, the mother bobcat returned. Not often, perhaps once a week, but always at twilight. She never came close, never lingered long, just watched from the edge of the woods. Once, Elena stepped onto the porch and whispered, "He's okay. He's healing." She didn't expect a response, but the bobcat held her gaze for a full minute before slipping silently back into the shadows. It was enough. By late March, the mountain began to exhale. The deep snows melted into rivulets that wound their way down the slopes, feeding into creeks and streams that sang again after months of silence. Ferns unfurled like slow-breathing lungs, and robins stitched their calls into the forest air. Elena stood beneath the towering firs at the back of her property, watching the final phase of the enclosure take shape. The workers had finished the outer fencing days ago, tall enough to prevent climbing, reinforced below ground to prevent digging. But what made this place more than a pen was what lay inside. Tree stumps perfect for perching, shaded rock shelves, a pile of hollow logs, a den lined with bark and cedar shavings. The small artificial stream glinted under the morning light, already luring curious birds. It wasn't the wild, but it was close, and it was ready. Dr. Harris had scheduled the transfer for Friday. Finch, now 8 months old, was eating well, walking on his healed leg with only the faintest hitch, and showing signs of adolescent energy, pouncing, stalking shadows, testing boundaries. But he'd also failed 2 critical rewilding benchmarks. He didn't flinch at the sight of humans. He didn't hide when exposed to their scent. "We can't release him," Dr. Harris had told her 2 days earlier, "but we can still give him a life that respects who he is." That had become Elena's mantra. The drive back from the wildlife center was quieter than the one before. No storm, no ice, no frantic prayer. Finch rested in a reinforced crate in the rear of her SUV. The staff had prepared him with weeks of gradual changes. Forest scents, open-air play structures, food placed in natural containers. Still, Elena couldn't stop glancing at the mirror, catching glimpses of movement through the vented panels. When they arrived, she opened the hatch and crouched beside the carrier. "You're home," she whispered. "Not your old home, not the forest, but something new, something in between." Dr. Harris met her at the enclosure gate. He nodded once, and together they lifted the crate into the entry chamber. Then Elena stepped back. Slowly, the gate swung open. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a paw appeared, silent, careful. Finch stepped out, body low, muscles tight. His eyes scanned the enclosure, ears swiveling. Step by step, he emerged into the filtered sunlight. His nose twitched, his shoulders shifted. Then, with sudden grace, he leapt onto the nearest stump and perched like a king surveying his realm. Dr. Harris exhaled. "He's adapting." Elena couldn't speak. Her chest was tight with something that was not quite joy, deeper, heavier, sharper. The next few days passed in rhythms she hadn't known she'd been missing. Feeding schedules, quiet observation, meticulous notes. Finch explored the enclosure as if drawing maps in his mind, marking boundaries, revisiting corners, testing the stream. He stalked leaves and pounced on moss. At night, she saw him curled inside the den, eyes glowing faintly through the mesh, watching the moon rise over the treetops. Elena kept her distance, Food was delivered through a no-contact chute. Enrichment items were rotated. She resisted the urge to speak aloud when he paced near the fence, even when his gaze lingered. The staff at the center had warned her, "He's not a pet. He never can be." But she had never seen him that way. He was a life entrusted to her, a life she had promised to protect. The mother bobcat returned on the 7th night. Elena had set trail cams, mostly for Finch's safety, but sometimes she scrolled through the footage just to feel connected to the woods beyond the fence. That evening, she didn't need the cameras. She saw the movement with her own eyes, a shadow slipping through the rhododendrons at the edge of the clearing. Elena froze, heart hammering, and stepped quietly onto the porch. The bobcat moved deliberately, not toward the house, but toward the enclosure. Finch saw her too. He had been resting near the stream. At the sight of her, he rose slowly, ears forward. She approached the mesh but didn't try to enter or touch. She simply sat. So did he. For nearly 10 minutes, they stared at one another through the barrier. Two mirror images in the soft light, tails curled, shoulders relaxed. Elena didn't move. She barely breathed. Then the mother stood. She circled the enclosure once, nose low to the ground. At the far side, she paused, looked back over her shoulder, and vanished into the trees. Elena stepped back inside and wept. Over the following weeks, the bobcat returned 3 more times. Each visit was shorter, less lingering. Finch began reacting less intensely, not out of disinterest, Elena believed, but from something more primal, a knowing, a readiness. This is what would have happened in the wild, Dr. Harris said over the phone. By now they would have separated anyway. Still, Elena whispered, she comes back. Because she remembers, he said. She knows. One afternoon in late April, Elena received the final confirmation. Her certification had been approved, fully and without condition. She was now a licensed wildlife caregiver, authorized to house Finch under permanent care. The email ended with a line that made her breath hitch. Thank you for honoring the trust placed in you, both by the animal and the wild. Elena stepped out onto the porch. Finch lay stretched on a high log in the afternoon sun, eyes half closed, tail flicking lazily. At the forest's edge, a shape moved between the trees, watching. Elena raised her hand, not to wave, but in silent acknowledgement. I kept my promise, she said, in the only way I could. Spring melted into summer, and with it, the sharp edges of survival softened. The mountains pulsed with life again. Dragonflies danced above the stream in Finch's enclosure. Bees trembled through the lupines, and every morning the robins returned to sing on Elena's porch railing. Finch had grown. His lanky adolescent frame now held muscle and grace. His coat was thick and dappled with the richness of his species, and his injured leg, once limp and uncertain, now carried him without hesitation. He had adapted to his world, a home built not to tame him, but to honor what he was. Elena kept her rhythm too. Feedings, observations, sketches. Her third wildlife book, once stalled, now bloomed with stories and illustrations she never imagined she'd witness. But the heart of her work was no longer just the wild. It was the space between. The liminal, fragile connection where trust and distance, instinct and compassion coexisted. And still, sometimes, at dusk, the mother returned. Not always, not regularly, but enough. She never approached the fence anymore. She never vocalized or searched. She would appear from the woods, stand for a time in the tall grass, and watch. Then she would disappear, like a breath released. Elena had stopped questioning the meaning of her visits. They were what they were. Enough for her. Enough perhaps for Finch, too. One evening in early June, Elena stood at the edge of the enclosure, notebook in hand. The light was golden, casting long shadows across the ferns and logs. Finch sat on a high perch, tail draped like a lazy ribbon, eyes half-lidded. "You've changed me," she said softly, not expecting him to react. But his ears twitched. "Not just you, your mother. The moment she stepped onto that porch, she rewrote something in me." She didn't need him to understand. She just needed to say it. That weekend, Elena received an invitation. The State Wildlife Agency had seen her recent article in Northwest Conservation Quarterly. They wanted her to speak, briefly, at a regional event celebrating wildlife rehabilitation efforts. It wasn't her style. She hadn't been on a stage in years. But something nudged her. A quiet echo of that promise, still pulsing in her chest. When she spoke, she didn't tell them just about Finch's leg or the enclosure specs or her license. She told them about a cold January morning, a scratching at the door, amber eyes filled with fear and faith, a choice that had not been safe or easy or clear, but had been right. When she finished, the room was silent, then slow applause, and afterward, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "I used to think the wild didn't need us," she said, "but now I see, sometimes it chooses us." The months rolled forward. Finch settled into his sanctuary fully. He learned to hunt live insects, to bat at branches, to pace and stretch and vanish into his den with the dignity of the wild still burning in his eyes. Elena built a second enclosure for temporary rescues. She took in an injured hawk, a pair of orphaned raccoons, even a young fox for 3 weeks. Finch never paid them much attention. His world was his own, and she respected that. She began offering virtual workshops, how to coexist with wildlife, how to read tracks, how to resist the human urge to interfere, and how to know when not interfering is the greater harm. The trail cameras continued to catch glimpses of the mother bobcat through the seasons. Once, in early autumn, Elena saw her with a new kitten trailing behind her. She smiled. "You made it," she whispered. "You're still living free." It was enough. By the time winter returned, the routine was a heartbeat. One morning, as snow dusted the forest again, Elena found herself sketching Finch beneath a fir tree, half buried in frost. His pose was regal, ancient, as though he belonged not to her enclosure, not to these woods, but to something older, a myth passed down in silence. That night she lit a fire in the hearth and curled up with her journal. Under the date, she wrote, "He was never mine. But I was his, for a moment, for a promise, for a reason I may never fully understand." And that was enough. In time, people stopped asking why the bobcat came to her door. They asked instead what she had done to be worthy of such trust. Elena never claimed to have the answer. All she knew was that on a night when the forest held more danger than comfort, a mother had risked everything not for herself, but for her child. And she had knocked. And someone had opened the door.